Good afternoon. Well, first of all, it's really wonderful to be here. When Fred was introducing me and pointed out it wasn't the first time I was in this area, I thought he was going to refer to the last time I spoke here at the Anza College. But then, of course, he reminded me that my very first visit to this part of California was in a police car. And I lived for quite some time in a small holding cell in Palo Alto, and the trial eventually took place in San Jose. First, let me say that it's really wonderful to be here, and I want to thank everyone involved in organizing this event, Edmundo Norte, and of course Sherrod Lynn, Michelle Cordova, and all of the representatives of the San Jose Peace and Justice Center. And it's so wonderful to see Fred Hirsch again. Whom I've known, as he pointed out, for over 40 years, and whose work, along with that of the Community Alert Patrol, helped the legal defense team to pick a jury that was willing to listen to the defense we presented, and therefore was responsible, along with the participation of millions of people all over the world who were demanding freedom for Angela Davis and all political prisoners. So I want to talk for a short time, and because this has been billed as a conversation, I definitely want to allow time for a dialogue with you. It's wonderful to see so many of you here. I think your presence is an indication of the fact that we have reached a very particular kind of historical conjuncture. And I want to begin by saying that we're all very fortunate to be alive at this moment. Because this is a moment that tells us that change is possible, that radical change is possible. Virtually every day we read about some act of police violence, police racism, right? And there are those who say, I wonder why the police are killing so many black and brown people these days. And what, of course, they don't recognize is that this violence has a very long history. It goes all the way back to the era of slavery, all the way back to the era of the genocidal colonization of this land and the destruction of the lives of indigenous people. What has made it possible for racist police violence to become a public issue is precisely the activism of young people, and a few older ones, but mostly young people, all over the country. Last summer, when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, did we imagine that within such a relatively short period of time, new movements would emerge, protests would happen, daily demonstrations would occur, solidarity would be coming forth from countries all over the world, including from occupied Palestine? So I want us to begin by recognizing that racism never occurs in isolation from global economic and political developments. We speak out, of course, against the racism we experience inside this country, against Black people, against Latinos, against Native Americans, Asian Americans, Arab and Muslim Americans. But it is important to recognize that this racism has global dimensions as well. And perhaps most important for us to understand as we attempt to build movements and build resistance against racist violence today is perhaps what is most important is to understand the extent to which anti-Arab and anti-Muslim racism have been, you might say, articulated with anti-Black and anti-Latino racism to produce even more dangerous modes of violence and inequality under the sign of the war on terror. And I mention this because oftentimes we assume that we're talking about two different things. But we learned very quickly last summer when we saw the police in Ferguson perform in their military garb, with their military weapons, with their military armored cars, and using tear gas that Palestinian activists noticed through the images that were disseminated through social media were made by the exact same company as provided the Israeli army with tear gas that was used against Palestinian activists. So I think in the very first place we have to acknowledge the global context of what is happening here. And I had the opportunity, was it 2 or 3 weeks ago, to spend some time with a woman by the name of Razmia Odeh. And I'm wondering if anybody is familiar with her name, Razmia Odeh. Okay, the Saturday Peace and Justice Center knows Razmia Odeh, who lives in Chicago and has been a community activist for many years. She was recently arrested and imprisoned and eventually charged with filling out fraudulent information on a naturalization application. Razmia Odeh is a Palestinian American woman who spent time in an Israeli prison and was tortured, was sexually tortured in front of her father. So much so that it has been extremely difficult for her to even describe what happened to her many years ago. The reason she has been charged with filling out fraudulent information on a naturalization application is because she did not say she had been convicted. You know, they ask you, have you ever been convicted of a crime? Right? How many applications do you fill out when they ask that question? When you want to get a job, as a matter of fact, generally when you apply for admission to an educational institution, as a matter of fact, you should know parenthetically that there are campaigns all over the country designed to ban the box. Ban the box. because, of course, the collateral consequences of having been exposed to the prison industrial complex mean that it will be difficult for you ever to find a job for the rest of your life. In some states, it will be impossible for you to participate in the political process of electing someone to office. But I was talking about Razmia O'Day, who now is going to be deported to Jordan if we do not create the kind of movement that will save her life. And she's such an amazing person. I had the opportunity to spend time with her at a conference that took place recently in Chicago. And I'd like to urge all of you to go to the Razmia O'Day website. You will be able to find further information about her case and about what you can do to save her life. Prison abolitionists. And when we talk about institutionalized racism today, when we talk about institutionalized racist violence, we have to talk about the prison system. We have to acknowledge that there are over 1.5 million people in the various facilities that are associated with the prison industrial complex. Not only state and federal prisons, but city and county jails, and not only jails and prisons, but also immigrant detention facilities. Immigrant detention facilities represent, for private prison companies, the most profitable sector of private prison businesses. As a matter of fact, the private prison companies are responsible for some of the most repressive legislation against immigrants. And we all know what has been going on in places like Arizona and Alabama and Georgia. You can thank the private prison companies for trying to create conditions for the entrance of more bodies into immigrant detention facilities. But we also have to talk about jails in Indian country, which constitute a separate category. And when we think about the ways in which the violence of the genocidal colonization that laid the basis for what we all often speak about as the U.S. democracy. Isn't that kind of like a contradiction in terms? But I think that that we should always acknowledge that whatever we do, wherever we're gathering on the land of indigenous people. Let us never forget that. And then there are the military prisons. Perhaps you know about the case of Chelsea Manning and many others who are in prisons and in the military. As a matter of fact, instead of calling this a democratic country, we should call it a prison nation. Because there are more prisons in this country than anywhere else in the world. There are more people in prison than anywhere else in the world. There are proportionately more people behind bars. So if there's anything that is distinctive about the United States of America, it is that it is a prison nation. not only want to end mass incarceration, and I think it's important that we're talking a lot about mass incarceration, right? But we don't want to just end mass incarceration. We want to end incarceration. Yeah. We want to put an end. We want to create a society that no longer relies on prisons and incarceration. Because incarceration as a strategy is embedded in capitalist approaches to society. Incarceration is related to the fact that profit is considered to be more important than people. Incarcerate the people whose potential welfare in already marginalized communities poses a threat to the expansion of profit. That is to say, in order to create societies where people can live decent lives, the resources of society have to be used to create housing and education and jobs and healthcare, physical healthcare and mental healthcare, and all of the things we need. When those resources are used to generate profit for the 1%, then warehouses have to be created for those people whose lives become superfluous, for those people who are considered to be garbage, for those people who are basically thrown away. The rise of the prison industrial complex was very much related to the production of carceral strategies used to maintain the occupation of Palestine. As a matter of fact, the U.S. and Israel have had lasting alliances, military alliances, carceral alliances. And as a matter of fact, do we know that many police departments in this country, local police departments, have gone to Israel to be trained by the Israeli military? Because the Israeli military are considered to be the military force in the world that is at the forefront of the so-called war on terror. And if one considers how easy it is to be pinpointed as a terrorist threat. Well, I get to talk about myself. Some 40 years ago, when I was placed on the FBI's most wanted list, and I'll never forget that Nixon was the president at that time. You remember him, right? You know who he is. You may not remember him, but you have a historical memory of Richard Nixon. And who's the other guy who used to be the governor of California? What's his name? Reagan. Yes, that's right. Ronald Reagan. So as a matter of fact, when we moved to the 1980s, and what we might call the Reagan-Bush era, we see the preparation for the focus on security, the rise of the prison industrial complex, and the complete deindustrialization of the economy. We see the rise of global capitalism. Not that capitalism wasn't already global, because when we think about all of the imperialist incursions, I could talk about that forever. But I just want to, I guess the point that I'm trying to make today in this talk at the Anza College in Cupertino, California, this is where we are, right? In Silicon Valley, right? Which is responsible for so much of the globalization of communications and the ability to transmit information globally. And I always say it's so weird that during this period, when everything becomes global, when companies go global, when jobs move across borders, when people can't find jobs in the U.S. because the companies discover that their sources of labor that are not organized in other countries and therefore are cheaper, and so they destroy entire communities in search of profit. And when everything basically starts to move across national borders, when companies, when information, ideas, money, and then when people start to cross borders, they're referred to as illegal. Now, why is it we can't say that the corporations are illegal? And all of the capital that has crossed borders, why can't we declare that that is illegal? Because that has actually produced poverty in the global south, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. So I want to call them illegal. And I want to say that no human being should ever be referred to as illegal. I want to talk about one other international campaign before I conclude and invite you to ask questions. I want to talk about Colombia. A few days ago, I happened to see, for the third or fourth time, a young woman whom I've known for a few years, whose name is Francia Marquez. And she is from Colombia, near the city of Cali, from a community that is called La Toma, which has been inhabited by people of African descent, by Afro-descended Colombians since the 1600s. Cumbia. Yes. And her people were brought from Africa to engage in coal mining in Colombia, but immediately they escaped and created a maroon community. And we can relate to that because we have histories of maroon communities in this country. We have histories of African slaves who escaped and who were able to make community with indigenous people, with Native Americans. And we should actually applaud that history because that's the history of freedom. That's the history of struggle. That's the history of resistance. And so Francia's people lived as free people in La Toma. They've lived there since the 1600s, living from their gold mining efforts. And I mean, I've spoken about this several times, but every time I speak about it, it brings chills to my body. I remember my visit to La Toma, talking to the people who lived in that community. And by the way, it was a 2.5-hour trip up a dirt road to the top of a mountain in a jeep. And so people started to talk about mining. And we usually think about mining as an industrial job, right? We don't think about women miners. And there's a long history of progressive struggles around the miners in this country. But in the community of La Toma, everybody participated in the mining process. The children were miners. The women were miners. There was one woman I was speaking to who, when I asked her how long she had been a miner, she said, "I've been a miner since I was in my mother's womb." And they talked about that work with as an activity that was so beautiful and moving. And as a matter of fact, what I found most remarkable was that they had managed to figure out how to engage in gold mining without at all disturbing the environment. They did it without machinery. It was done in such a way that anyone could do it. And as a matter of fact, the entrance to the mine, I had the opportunity to actually visit a mine. The entrance to a mine was maybe about 3 or 4 feet high. You had to bend over to walk into it. Otherwise, you never would have known that there was a mine there. But you know where I'm going. Once the transnational mining companies discovered how much gold there was, they applied for licenses from the Colombian government to engage in the kind of mining that would literally destroy that community, destroy the mountain. And as it turns out, even though the people of La Toma had purchased the land, and they had title to the land, the title is only to the surface of the land. The title is not to the subsoil, to the minerals. And so the government has been trying for some time now to evict them. They won the first struggle. But now the mining companies are trying to engage in illegal mining with the paramilitaries providing their security. And Francia, who is a young woman in her, I think, early 30s, and she's about this tall, powerful though, absolutely powerful. She is the spokesperson for her community.